No mai, haere mai, kia koutou katoa. Ko Caroline Orchiston tōku ingoa. Welcome along to this month's QuakeCoRE seminar series. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce our two presenters, Saskia de Vilder and Emma Hudson-Doyle. And they're going to be talking about Hōretireti Whenua-Sliding Lands, their new endeavour program, which was funded last year, which is all about creating nationally applicable landslide risk models for New Zealand. Before we get underway with the presentations today, I'd just like to sort of run through the run sheet for the morning, the session. We'll be kicking off with about 25 minutes from our presenters. If you have any questions throughout the session, just feel free to add those into the chat. If you'd like to ask your question yourself at the end, then just raise your hand and I'll facilitate that at the end of the session. Also, if you could all just mute your mics just to make sure we don't have any interruptions during the presentations. And so first of all, I'd like to now introduce our two speakers. So Saskia de Vilder is an engineering geologist at GNS Science. Her research interests span understanding rock slope failure mechanisms, landslide runout analysis, hazard and risk modelling, and the interface between science and policy. She's led the development of the natural hazard risk analysis framework that allows risks to be consistently addressed across DOC sites nationally. And she's also the lead author on the recently released landslide planning guidance for land use planners. Emma Hudson-Doyle works at Massey University. She works at the interface of physical and social science with a focus on communicating the science of natural hazards. Her current focus is on scientific uncertainty, communicating and understanding complex multi-component models used to advise decision makers, and she provides expert communication advice to several national agencies during events, including the Aotearoa Earthquake Science Advisory Panel, Tokatuaki EQC, and she's the current editor-in-chief of the Journal of Applied Volcanology. She also sits on the SAGE steering group for seasonal sub-seasonal applications for the World Meteorological Office. So welcome along, both of you. Really looking forward to hearing all about your endeavour, and I'll hand over now to Saskia to get underway. Kia ora.
Thanks, Caroline, for the introduction. Kia ora koutou, and yeah, it's a great opportunity to come and be able to talk to you today about our new endeavour, which is really exciting. So it's been led by myself and Emma with a whole wide range of collaborators across New Zealand and internationally. So what is Hōretireti Whenua-Sliding Lands about? So our aim is to provide consistent and robust national models that link rapid landslide susceptibility. So we're really talking about these kind of landslides that are often triggered by earthquake and rainfall events. They've got this really rapid velocity, which kind of don't allow for kind of evacuation times, and they present both a life safety and economic risk to the population. So we want to be able to link where these landslides occur through to what they might impact, through to individual, community, property and vulnerability risks. So that's our aspirational and kind of aim. So this might be old news for many of you, but our risk from landslides across Aotearoa is substantial. We know they cause on average about $250 to $300 million a year. We know, from the Kaikoura earthquake that the damage to State Highway 1, that was mainly from landslides, was attributed to be $1.1 billion. And looking back over our fatality record, we know that earthquake-induced landslides have killed about 63 people. We also know that if you spend, like all the stuff beforehand, if you spend $1 on mitigation measures prior to event, you can save $4 to $11 post-event. And in areas of high, landslide risk globally, such as Hong Kong, where they've implemented strong landslide risk management kind of activities, they've been able to reduce their landslide risk by about 50%. But one of the key things we need to be able to do those is we need a consistent evidence base that can be used for decision making to make sure that whatever risk management activities we undertake are targeted and effective. So what does our current state of national models really look like? So on this diagram here, we've kind of split the landslide, our components of the different landslide models out into different boxes. So we talk about our landslide susceptibility model, and here we're kind of essentially talking about almost the source areas of landslides. And then we have a landslide movement or run out model. And that's basically once a landslide starts, how far does it travel and what may it impact? We've then kind of switched it into these different bits of whether a landslide is rapid or whether it's slow, and that affects kind of the risk from those landslides. And then for the different kind of trigger events, so earthquake-induced, rainfall-induced landslide dams. So these kind of show roughly some of the kind of broad overarching components of a kind of a national landslide risk model. And then we have I guess the different levels of maturity of those models across the top. So we go from an alpha, so this is where we have algorithms that have shown a proof of concept, but they can't yet be nationally or applied. They need a bit of further research and calibration. Then we have a beta, where we've kind of got a pilot model that has been developed, but it needs further validation, and it also requires some end user feedback. And then we have version 1 and version N. So as you can see in this diagram, the only one that we have consistently nationally at the moment is an earthquake-induced susceptibility model that's available at 32 meters resolution. And then across the country, I guess we have a patchwork of different kind of rainfall-induced landslide susceptibility models and different run-out models. And then we have, limited information on vulnerability and risk. So within this Endeavour program, what we are really trying to do is kind of push the bars, these different bars for all these different components in the red boxes up to that state that by the end of it, we can get that to the stage where we have these kind of beta models that could be applied. And this allows us to, do things like this. So this is an example that was done for Cyclone Gabrielle, where luckily beforehand we had a rainfall-induced landslide susceptibility model that was trained for the Auckland region. And our susceptibility models, they can take dynamic inputs such as rainfall forecasts, and they link it to other kind of variables such as slope, angle, geology, and then they can use to predict where we would expect there's a high probability of a landslide occurring. So it takes that, we can produce our kind of hazard map, which is in this top corner. And then from there, we can start to produce impact forecasts, right? So this was provided by a riskscape. And we could say for forecasts in the hours leading up to Cyclone Gabrielle, we could estimate the number of properties that might be affected per ward, the number of landslides per kilometre of road or rail. But at the moment, we can't do this consistently nationally. So this is one of the goals, is that we'd be able to maybe produce products like this. But we do know that we have got a wealth of landslide data across New Zealand. So for example, we've just been mapping, as part of the Cyclone Gabrielle response, about 150,000 landslides. And we've got many other data sets, but we haven't got that consistent evidence base that allows us to take that information and make it usable for individuals, businesses, and communities. And that means we really need to be able to predict, okay, so where might a landslide occur? Where might it start on a slope for different trigger events? Once it starts, where does it run out? What does it impact downslope? And then what are the consequences and risks? And often, especially at a regional scale, when we think about this, these model components are often developed separately. They're not easily to be linked together, i.e. to provide the necessary information to each different stage of that risk equation. So it's quite hard to estimate the risk, or even to kind of unpick those different dynamics and understand what is driving the risk. So really the aim in this research program is to create robust, probabilistic and scenario-based kind of decision-relevant landslide models for the most rapid and dangerous landslide types, so that we can forecast where such landslides might occur for earthquake and rainfall events, who or what they may impact, at the appropriate scales and accuracies. And that's a really key point actually throughout this research program, is we need to really kind of find that sweet spot between the model complexity and model use, so that these models can be used by end users for short-term and long-term decision-making needs. And so again, we can kind of think about it. We're trying to really answer most of these different elements of a risk equation question. So when you think about a landslide risk equation, you kind of want to understand, well, what's the probability of a particular scenario occurring? So what's the probability of a particular type or size of landslide occurring for a trigger event? Okay, if that landslide does occur, what's the probability that it might reach our element at risk, be that a person, road, rail, or buildings. And given, and if that scenario reaches that element at risk and that element at risk is present, then what is the proportion of loss or probability of loss occurring for that element at risk? And we've kind of mimicked that a little bit in our structure. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Emma, and hopefully we'll have a seamless transition.
Kia ora koutou, and we're just going to swap our screens over so I can take over. So if you stop sharing, and then I'll, oops, sorry about this. It's just here. Oops. Right, you should also be able to see my screen. So one of the things we wanted to do with this time here was also introduce you to the structure of the program as well. And so what you can see on the right-hand diagram here is how we've structured our program around 6 key themes. So we have a group of team, and I'll talk about each team in more detail in a minute, but we have one which is looking at people, perceptions and decisions, one which is looking at landslide susceptibility, one which is looking at landslide runout, one which is looking at the vulnerability of people, infrastructure and buildings. And these are all wrapped around 2 regional case studies, one which is the Auckland region impact case study, and the other which is based in Tairāwhiti, looking at some of the lessons there around recent events in the Tairāwhiti region. And across this, we're aiming to provide, as Saskia has said, consistent and robust national decision relevant models that are linking across that rapid landslide susceptibility, the where, the type and the volume, through to the landslide movement and run out, on into that individual community and property vulnerability and risk, and out through those socioeconomic models. And one of the challenges is understanding the many different types of products and outputs that people will need and want. So as we said, as Saskia was saying earlier on, at the moment, we currently have these models that are at about 32 meters nationally. They have a limited patchwork for the rainfall-induced and landslide and runout models, and limited to no information on vulnerability and risk. We're hoping that by the end of the research program, we're going to be building up this national model. So it with runout down to about 15-meter resolution, earthquake-induced landslide and rainfall-induced, also at the 15-meter, that we've got a really good understanding of the user personas, needs, timeframes, such that we can have this national landslide risk model that can be applied at both regional and national scales. And as Saskia was saying, the scale is the real challenge, is understanding the different scales of need versus the scales that can be actually robustly delivered from such a model. And through this, we have a range of end users ranging from DOC to NEMA to EQC, and products that we envisage ranging from forecasts through to nowcasts. So the team is structured here, and we've put this up because many of you will be working with a number of people in the team. And so this gives you an opportunity to understand who they are and where they fit in that team, and how maybe we can look for some synergies across existing research programs that you might be doing or activities. So leadership is myself and Saskia, and we have support from Janine Bidmead and Chris Massey. And then leading the RA 1.1 People and Perceptions and Decisions is myself. Susceptibility is Chris Massey and Hugh Smith at GNS Science and Manaaki Whenua. Runout is Saskia. The Vulnerability, People, Infrastructure and Buildings theme with Nick Holspall at GNS Science. The Tairāwhiti case study is Kelvin Tapuki and David Johnson from Massey University in partnership with Tūranganui or Ngāti Porou. And then the 6th theme is Gary McDonald and Merit and Market Economics, looking at the socioeconomic. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about each one of those. So firstly, the people, perceptions and decisions theme. So this is really aimed around how do we understand what individuals and organizations actually want from these models, and how are they using them? How does their understanding of the landslide phenomena itself, as well as thinking about how they understand the triggers, the types of landslides and what a landslide can do, how does that actually influence their use of the models and the products that are coming out of these models? And then in turn, how do they understand what vulnerability is, and what does that mean for how we're actually incorporating vulnerability into the models in theme 4? We also want to understand what components of these landslide models is most effective for decision making. What do people actually need to know for short-term risk management and long-term resilience? And how do those perceptions and uses change across different user groups, different organizational operational contexts? In particular, how does that change for different scales, different complexity, and different timeframes of outputs? And this feeds into the the other themes and directly back into the actual development of the model outputs and the way we're thinking about what parts of the model are we going to be focusing on. Theme 2 is the susceptibility theme, and it's actually really trying to answer that question: can landslide susceptibility models be developed in such a way that they can actually forecast the probability of occurrence of rapid landslides at those appropriate scales? Is it possible to move beyond and actually think about those different issues around high, low resolution data and the different time and path dependencies for this? And also, a critical question is how complex do we need to be going for these products and these outputs to be useful? And what is the data worth for these different elements? A big part of this program is also actually, as Saskia was saying, there's a huge wealth of data sets out there. So a big part of that program is actually thinking about data set harmonization across organizations, thinking about those kind of data standards and how to align them, and actually moving beyond and thinking about, how does this work as a system? Research aim 3, which is Saskia's research theme, is looking at runout, and in particular, thinking about for different triggers and different types of landslides, how can we link that through from the susceptibility outputs and then on into creating the right kind of information and data sets that are useful for vulnerability and fragility analysis. And then that can also be used to kind of explore some of those complex scenarios, such as, landslide dams, and ideally developing a landslide runout ensemble model in the long term. So it can actually provide the necessary information and range of information and uncertainty that we need for our vulnerability analyses. Research aim 1.4 is the vulnerability theme, and that's looking at the people, infrastructure, and building. And it's actually, can we move that step further and think about the quantification of human building and infrastructure vulnerability so it can feed in effectively into risk models? And this is obviously built around and through the Riskscape, and it will be using the Riskscape platform. It will involve developing vulnerability models, thinking about some of those really useful user interfaces from Riskscape so that individuals can come along and organizations and actually dig into the different components of that, that risk equation that Saskia was showing earlier, and actually really understand, which bits do they need to know about for their decisions? How does this all come together? And actually try and unpick, what are some of the levers that are might be increasing risk in some areas. There's also a component here that links directly back to theme 1, which is around impact-based warnings and impact-based risk information. And that's being led by Sarah Harrison and Sally Potter and the team bridging us across. And it's really trying to understand, how do we move beyond some of the risk communication that maybe is not so effective, particularly in certain situations, and on into these impact-based ways of thinking about risk. So theme 5 is the Tairāwhiti case study, and that's directly in partnership with Te Ranganui o Ngāti Porou. And through this, they're going to be recording the lessons and learnings from the recent events from Cyclone Bola and Cyclone Gabrielle, obviously cognizant of the time that it takes for people to think about those lessons for Cyclone Gabrielle and explore future pathways for actually developing community-based approaches to managing and understanding this risk. It will also involve designing capability assessment for Te Ranganui o Ngāti Porou and its runanga in conjunction with the broader emergency management community, again, to build up this landslide resilience, but it's also tied into some of the other resilience and preparedness efforts in the community around tsunami and earthquake. And from that, also to enhance some of the natural hazards preparedness and response through educational programs delivered to kura kaupapa Māori and mainstream schools in Tairāwhiti. And then research aim 6, which is our Auckland-based impact case study, led by Market Economics and Gary McDonald. And that's really looking into, can we develop the kind of algorithms we need that will link the landslide hazard, vulnerability, risk, and through into the socioeconomic models of merit? And then and how can we then use that in an effective way to allow us to understand the direct and distributional impacts from landslides in that Auckland region case study? In particular, how does, these varying elements, these varying layers in this model actually impact those outcomes and those impacts for different scenarios? So thinking about different socioeconomic futures, thinking about different resilience building mitigations or climate change adaptations. What kind of impacts do they actually have on, well, what kind of influence, rather, do they actually have on the impacts of these landslides? And finally, also, what's the data and model worth of these models and the different layers within the models? How do we actually understand? And that ties also back to some of the other things we were saying earlier about, like, how do we manage the uncertainties of the different layers? How do we think about the complexity and how complex it needs to be and what that means for the data? So we thought, with a little bit of time we've got left to present, that it would be useful to give you a little bit of a rundown of one of the things that we've been focusing on in the first few months of this project, which is actually sits within theme 1, which is the theme that I'm leading. And this particular program of stream of research is working in collaboration with Charlotte Brown at ResOrgs, Catalina Miranda at Massey, and the wider RA1 team. So Julia Becker, Sally Potter, Sarah Harrison, Marianne Clive, and hopefully I haven't forgotten anyone, Lauren as well, Lauren Vanel. And we are looking at identifying the personas and needs across the different decision timeframes, who's using this information and why. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to the QuakeCoRE community about this today, and we thought it would be useful, was that it actually, lots of you are also working with stakeholders out there. Lots of you are also working with model information, risk information that you're actually bringing into the community to help make decisions. And so I think we can really learn from each other, from our experiences, and perhaps look for some synergies and ways to kind of connect through to understand, who needs this information and how. So the goal is to identify different persona groups that use landslide models and information. Through this, we're hoping to identify the decision needs and use cases that will actually directly inform model development, design, and output design. And this will also be used as a fairly novel social science participant selection method. So next year, we're going to be doing 3 core strands of research, looking at people's understanding the risk perception of landslides and phenomena, their model understanding, and also their perception of vulnerability. And so we'll actually be using these personas as a way of stratifying and choosing participants for that as well. So in developing the persona list, we need to be we've been thinking about some major categories. So firstly, it's around the organizational and individual context. So are these users private or public? The frequency of the model use, their scale of model use, whether it's national, regional, or local, their data use. So are they primary users or secondary users? What's the most relevant model layer to them? Are they interested in the socioeconomic output? Are they interested in the risk output? Or are they more interested in, like, the run out layer or the susceptibility layer? Which bit of it is most useful to them? And then the use of information. And this is a really key aspect that we're trying to really understand, is around, we tend to think of these outputs just going out there, but actually some users may be translating them for someone else. They may be onward communicating them. They may be just consuming them, or they may be making decisions around them. There's also several nuanced subcategories. So that might be the reason for use. Is it a planning decision? Is it a technical education? Is it life safety? The duration of the decision implication, because that obviously impacts the kind of information and products they're going to want from these models. Is this for an immediate short term, or is it long-term decision making? Their experience of use of previous models or information that's similar to this, as well as the potential that this information might have personal loss and impact. And that's quite important when we're thinking about how we convey information. So that could be reputational loss or impact, personal decision making, all these kind of things affect how people interact and will engage with information. So we need to understand that as well, and also the trigger of interest. So, are they interested in the earthquake-induced, rainfall-induced, or both? And as obviously, just to remind everyone that we're focusing on the rapid landslides here, so earthquake-induced and rainfall-induced landslides. And we're going to be prioritizing over the next couple of months, prioritizing these down to a short list to actually interview. So this is just a wee snapshot of the large sheet that we've been doing in order to identify who's out there, who's using this kind of information, how are we framing it. It's an incredibly long list that we've managed to shortlist down, but just wanted to give you an example of the kind of the nuances we're thinking about. So, for example, we'll have, have people that are making decisions at central government around life safety of risk, the risk of landslides due to life safety and property, and what kind of how this information can be used for reduction and readiness actions, as well as kind of the socio-economic impacts. We might also then have people that are thinking about how is this impacting infrastructure or systems of infrastructure. We might also have people thinking about how does this affect my property or property that I own, or how is this going to affect our business operations, or what does this mean for my community, and so on. So one of the key challenges at the moment is obviously in a perfect world, we'd want to interview every single person and build up this incredibly robust persona profile, but that would be a very large task. So obviously we're shortlisting it down to something that's a manageable amount. And the criteria for selection to develop personas like this is really around, the access to stakeholders, the potential that actually working with this stakeholder group is going to have a good impact upon our overall goal of building resilience and mitigating our risk of landslides. The feasibility of model use to user needs. So like, is this model information going to be useful to these users? We want to kind of target our efforts at where we can have the biggest impact. The current knowledge of the persona needs, are there some of those personas out there that we really don't know enough about and we really need to focus our efforts on bringing out? And ultimately, who do we need to know more about? Like, who do we need to know more about to make these models as best as they can be? We currently have 20 in the list, and we're currently shortening them further. And you say, why are we going to be interviewing these people more? We want to, once we have our persona group, each kind of stakeholder persona group, we'll be interviewing people within that group, and that's actually to ground truth our categorization. So a lot of our categorization and our understanding of these different users is coming from our own experience and the team's experience of working with these stakeholders over the time that they've been using the models. So we want to ground truth some of that, understand information needs and concerns and priorities. In particular, understand some of the dependees and some of, thinking about it more as a system of users rather than necessarily individual users. And some of those organizational perspectives that might be influencing why an individual might make a decision one way or the other, to build these use cases and use case scenarios. And so one of the things that's already coming really clear over the last couple of months, and Saskia discussed this as well, is this scale issue. It's really understanding the different levels of scale that people are making these decisions versus what we can robustly deliver given the uncertainties that will be, involved in the model, and how to do that in a way that gives people enough confidence to make the decisions they need to do as well. So this is just rounding out this little bit about the personas, just on my last slide, which is actually some questions to throw out into the audience for the QuakeCoRE community, because, many of you will be working with this or alongside this. So first of all, from a QuakeCoRE perspective, which personas would be most useful for your work as well? Because, this kind of helps us understand, mutual benefits around trying to actually build up these understanding of the community of users out there. Are there any questions or issues you'd think you'd like us to focus on in the interviews as well, in terms of your experience, particularly in the earthquake-induced landslide space? Can we identify any cross-project synergies around these personas? And then also just reflecting yourself on what difficulties have you had communicating to or receiving information from others when it comes to landslide or risk information that you think might be useful for us to explore in our persona or interview questions. And feel free to either chat to me at some point or email any of the team with any ideas that you might have about these. And that's us. And this is Saskia can maybe explain what this beautiful slide at the end.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, that's just an output from our earthquake susceptibility tool. So we thought we'd do that for QuakeCoRE's theme, and I think it's for 1 in 1,000 year earthquake event.